All right, this is a real treat.
You may think you're interviewing me, but that is a surprise.
We'll see how it goes.
Love your bow tie, by the way.
Thank you. It is so painful as a Duke man to be wearing this Maryland bow tie.
I know, I just don't understand why that is, so to speak.
By the way, I am collecting bow ties from all states, and I hope to travel to most of them during my tenure since there's so much. Had a great talk with Senator Murkowski last night, and I've not been to Alaska yet, so somehow I think a trip to Alaska is in my future. One reason this is such a treat, I think a lot of you know, going back to 2016, I used to have a monthly dinner with Dr. Pazdur in a nice location out in Bethesda, and we would argue for between 1 and 2.5 hours about all sorts of things. But it's a real privilege, I think, to work with somebody who has the conviction to take a stand, no matter how wrong he may be about some of the issues. But I do think the kind of courage that Rick has showed has really changed the field of oncology, and most of my arguments have to do with what does that have to do with the rest of medicine, because we have great needs in many other areas that are not moving as effectively as the oncology world is. So let's get right down to it. All right, I've got a short list here. I know we only have 30 minutes. So the first one is pretty simple. Why are you still doing this? You've been here a long time.
What's the other options? Unemployment? Well, I really like what I do. I think this is a special job because we get to see everything in drug development. And if you're at a university, for example, you might be working in one disease area. If you're in industry, you might be dealing with a drug or several drugs. But not only, I think one of the most important parts of this job is really to see what's going on throughout the entire industry, so to speak. And that's a unique vantage point that is really unparalleled in any other job that you have. And plus, really developing other people's careers. It's great satisfaction to me to see the people that we have developed go on to take jobs outside of the FDA, to grow up the ranks in the FDA, and that's a very rewarding aspect of the job also. So it's one that I think it's a unique job, and interestingly enough, I recognized that very early on when I took this job back in 1999. I always tell people, when I was leaving MD Anderson, I had lunch with John Mendelsohn, who many of you may know, the late John Mendelsohn, and he said, "Rick, I don't know why you're doing this. This is the biggest mistake of your life," okay? I said, well, I'll just have to see. The contract is signed, so we'll have to just move on there.
Well, I have no argument with what you said there. I think your dedication to both the careers of others and to the intellectual pursuit. I mean, I think the grand rounds that one thing I miss now compared to 2016 is I used to walk around the FDA and you just see rooms of people looking at data, trying to figure out what it means. And I think your efforts have been exemplary in this regard. But that gets me to a question a lot of people are asking now. We're here in person. If you walk around White Oak right now, there's a lot of empty space there. Many of us have, I think, at least from my perspective, successfully argued that if you look at all of the routine stuff the FDA had to do and the COVID pandemic onslaught of stuff, we don't have exact data. It's hard to metricize it, but all of that's gotten done while most stuff has been virtual. But now we're getting to decision time about what we're going to do about return to office, and there are certain members of Congress who have strong views about it. What are your views on this?
Well, empty space, the place is deserted, okay? If you went there, there are more security guards than employees that are there now. I think we have to come to the realization that there's been a seismic shift in the expectation of the workforce, okay? Before the pandemic, everybody just went to work Monday through Friday from 8 to 5, and that was just the thing to do, and nobody even questioned it. And now we've had this experience, so it really has opened up, I think, a new way of working that is not only at the FDA, but is in industry and throughout really multiple industries. What I see is probably moving toward more of a hybrid situation with a great degree of flexibility, okay? It makes no sense for us to go back to White Oak and then open up a computer and have a meeting on a computer, okay, when half the people are not there at White Oak, so to speak. So it really introduces kind of a new way of working, and this is not unique to the FDA, but it's going to be unique throughout multiple industries. So I would look at a position or a position for the workforce of one that has a great deal of flexibility. And we have to ask ourselves the question when we go back, what is the purpose of going back? It's not just to go back to make an administrator happy or to fill in a time clock, so to speak.
You got no sympathy for making administrators happy?
No. Well, when I actually came to the FDA, I'll share this with you. In 1999, there actually was a time clock that some people actually checked into, okay, which is kind of like, really, for professionals, you're asking them to punch a clock here? So this mentality needs to be really looked at of what we're doing, why we're doing it. And many people that are involved in intellectual pursuits obviously work outside of this 9 to 5 mentality. They're thinking about things throughout the day, through the weekend, et cetera. So we really have to be cognizant that it's just going to be a different workforce. And that's going to affect not only White Oak, but major cities, for example, my hometown, Chicago. That place is going to radically change. There's multiple large office buildings throughout the entire city. People are just not coming back to work, and it's going to affect the entire ecosystem of cities and how we do business.
Well, I mean, as you know, we're finalizing our next steps at FDA, and I think largely in sync with what you're saying. I think no one I know is arguing that 100% of people should be there like the old days. We have a lot of evidence about satisfaction with the job, but also productivity and the expectations of the industries that we regulate. We've heard loud and clear they do want in-person meetings, so there will be that component of it. But when I press the question, do you really want it so you have to schedule a meeting 2 months in advance and then have everyone travel to the beautiful Silver Spring and stay in the local hotel and all that? And people say, well, we'd sort of like to have both. And so I really think we'll be looking at the hybrid environment, much in step with what I saw in Silicon Valley. Not the Elon Musk type, but more of the same.
But I think,
Valley
Rob,
type.
even when you take a look at our ODAC meetings, you know, an in-person meeting is different from a virtual meeting, so to speak, and the dynamics do change too, and we have to be cognizant of that. And that has produced some changes of how we interact with companies, specifically during these meetings. There's much more of an egalitarian kind of platform when everybody is virtual, so to speak.
All right, now let's get down to business.
Yes.
You pushed through with the help of people like our hostesses here today, this accelerated approval thing. And a lot of people have not been happy about that. Others are ecstatic about it. You know, there's legislation afoot to change it. What are your current views about accelerated approval?
Well, we've written about this, so there's no reveal here, so to speak, that I'm giving. And you know, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, since oncology is really the vast user of accelerated approval. So most of the accelerated approvals are in our space. And Lola's sitting there right in front of me, and we just published an article a few months ago on the on and off ramps of accelerated approval, which really looks at the two issues here. The major thing that we're really interested in is companies having a comprehensive plan about what their confirmatory study is, what is the evidence that they're coming in to discuss this earlier on. This is really a very important issue, and we see this with many of the larger companies really adhering to this. They have, for example, when the PD-1 drugs were being developed, there were the accelerated approval studies, but there wasn't only one confirmatory studies. There might have been multiple confirmatory studies that were ongoing. Where we do get into trouble is with kind of a drug company that may not be adequately capitalized or something like that financially, wants to get their foot in the the door, so to speak, with a single-arm study of a very limited number of patients. That puts the patient at risk here, okay? And remember, there's a period of vulnerability that we have to control. And that period of vulnerability is between the time of the accelerated approval, if it is granted, and the confirmation or lack of confirmation of clinical benefit in the confirmatory study. And we should try to reduce that period of vulnerability as much as possible. So I think that is one of the major issues, and by having these conversations of what is the confirmatory study, should it be an ongoing study of the one that led to accelerated approval? We've brought out various aspects of different trial designs, which we have limited time, so I'm not going to go into that. The other issue that I think is very important, Rob, is the issue of taking drugs off the market, okay? You know, if a study has failed, okay, and the confirmatory study has clearly failed, then I think the companies have to step up and take these drugs off the market as rapidly as possible. And many of the companies have. Where we do get into problems, as you know, are companies that are unwilling to do so. We saw that not with a drug, but with an indication with Avastin. The McKenna issue was out there also recently. And I think these represent challenges of how to make the system more nimble, because a tremendous amount of resources have gone into these hearings to remove a drug. It's been 10 years, I think, since the Avastin hearing, and it still is a nightmare for me what we went through as far as the resources, the amount of hours that were spent in preparation, both on part of the company as well as the FDA, for very, very little reward. So, you know, there have been suggestions floated in Congress about the various ways of removing drugs. For example, having the review divisions or the office that approve the drug just say this drug should come off the market, and if there's disagreements, then they would go through a dispute resolution as they would normally do for any regulatory decision. There's also suggestions of perhaps there should be differential charging for the drug versus a drug that's under accelerated approval, and then a different price for the drug when it has received full approval. When I came to the agency in 1999, I realized that this was a problem. And with your predecessor,
Which one? There have been like five.
Mark McClellan, okay. I suggested, okay, and my reasoning was not his reasoning, so to speak. I suggested that drugs under accelerated approval not be considered available therapy. And my reason for that was that this would make companies want to do these studies as quickly as possible to block other drugs from getting accelerated approval. Unfortunately, that simply didn't work. It just didn't work.
Well, you've raised a number of issues. First of all, let me say I think we're in complete agreement. It's been an extremely valuable pathway. One of the key moments in my life, actually, which I know you remember, my mom's oncologist called and said, it's time to throw in the towel. She's had a good life. And I said, okay, you know, that makes sense, but let me just call Dr. Pazdur and see if there's anything new. And you had just done an accelerated approval that pertained to her, and she got 2 or 3 extra years of good life because of that phone call and that accelerated approval. But I really believe very strongly we need more teeth. And it includes the things you said, plus the idea of getting those confirmatory studies started before the approval, because once the approval occurs, it's very hard to hold back the marketeers from the things that they can do. But that raises another issue. You know, you used to be the champion of the single-arm trial, and you know that going back to 2016, I used to choke calling a single-arm study a trial. It's really a single-arm method.
A collection of case histories, would you say?
Something like that.
Okay, which I keep on reminding the staff, there's very little statistics in a single-arm trial. I think it has a role. Okay, let's go back. Again, I have a historical perspective of the single-arm trials. I think the first one that we did was in the late 1990s, fludarabine. That was, Michael Keating was the PI, I think, of that study at MD Anderson. And the one that I was involved with was the CPT-11 or irinotecan one for colon cancer was, I think, the second one, or one of the earlier ones that we did. And one of the things that we have to remember, those were areas and times when there was very, very little drugs out there. You know, for colon cancer in those days, if you failed 5-FU, you basically had no options. You couldn't use the drug again because nobody responds if they've had resistant disease to a fluorinated pyrimidine by another course of a fluorinated pyrimidine. So it was important to get that drug out. That's a much different situation where we have multiple drugs out there now, and we could do randomized studies. And I think we should look at the situation case by case. We also have to be realistic that there are more and more small molecular subtypes, particularly in lung cancer now that we're seeing, but I'm sure there are going to be in other areas that just preclude you know, doing a randomized study just because of numbers of patients. You can't take a look at a survival study when you have a small number of patients that exist worldwide with the disease. So we're going to have to say that response rate is of clinical benefit in those populations of patients, and that's the only endpoint that we could take a look at. And that gets to the whole issue of endpoints, and you know, we've had discussions about overall survival, response rates, time to progression, progression-free survival, and our thinking has evolved on this over the years. We used to call them surrogates. I don't believe they're surrogates, okay, by any stretch of the imaginations. Are they even correlates? Well, it probably depends upon the magnitude of benefit that one is seeing, but we believe that they perhaps have direct clinical benefit in their own right. For example, if a tumor shrinks, most people would say that's benefit to me, and that's what's used in clinical practice, basically, by doctors that are treating patients. If somebody sees that their patient is having a reduction in tumor mass, they're going to continue that therapy on and tell the patient that they're benefiting from that therapy. Likewise, if one has a rapidly progressive disease and one slows it down, that may be of direct benefit to that patient. So I don't want to get trapped so much into this issue of surrogacy versus correlates and what is the meaning. And we've been quite flexible on this, and I think to the benefit of patients during this 24-year period of time, so to speak.
So your answer is it depends, and I just would stress again, I regard randomization as a gift from God. I mean,
I couldn't agree more with you.
Okay.
You're preaching to the choir here, baby.
All right, that's great. Now, more about clinical trials. You've recently sort of been concerned about something that happened in cardiovascular disease 20 years ago, which is not globalization, but offshoring, which I regard as two related but different things. And you've noted that randomization trials are being done in other countries in preference to the U.S. in the field of oncology, more so than in the past. What's your view of that?
Well, again, we wrote about this, and our concern, well, let me tell you what we want, okay, rather than what our concerns are. We want multi-regional trials that represent the major ICH regions in the world, so to speak. So we want adequate representation of patients from North America, Europe, Asia, to be represented. We believe that this gives us a spectrum of representation of patients from our own country. We're not suggesting that all clinical trials have to be done in the United States, or there is a percentage that has to be done in the United States, but we want representation from all of the ICH regions in these countries. Having that, and this is in contrast to what we've had several a ODAC on, and that is drugs coming and being developed in a single country, for example. We find that somewhat problematic. I shouldn't use somewhat. We find it problematic, let's just say that, in that we really don't have the diversity of the US population. Frequently, we don't have experience with those countries from a regulatory point of view. And by having those countries participate in a multi-regional trials, we're actually bringing in those countries to kind of the international regulatory community by doing analysis of different sites and different countries. We're able to see if there are different results, different toxicities, different efficacy parameters that one may take a look at. So it's in really the long-term interest to have multi-regional trials being done throughout the world.
So my interpretation of what you're saying, which, and I hate to admit it, I completely agree, is globalization is good, multi-regional trials, representative trials, but moving trials out of the US just because you can do them less expensively in an environment which may not be pertinent to US practice.
Somewhat problematic, okay? And one of my major issues here is, why are people not doing these trials in the United States? If it's cost, that might be a reasonable issue, but one of my problems, which I hate to use this word ethics because I'm not an ethicist, is when people are doing trials because they can't do it in the United States because there's a better therapy that is approved here in the United States, and they're doing a randomized study against a known inferior therapy. I think this is particularly problematic, okay? And one of the reasons that people go on clinical trials, and we've enunciated this clearly throughout my entire 40-year career in doing clinical trials, is people that go on clinical trials should be getting the best therapies. There's no asterisk there that says only available or only approved in your country, so to speak. And I think we are going to have to answer to this if this continues, okay? People are going to potentially lose confidence in the system if they know that clinical trials are being done, okay, and they're getting inferior treatments, okay? Because we, again, live in a globalized world. There's no reason why a person in country X can't go to another country to get that drug, and are those patients adequately being addressed? Now, the counter-argument to that, as you know, and has been discussed in many ethics, is that these drug companies are giving drugs to patients that may not be able to get them, okay? That is an option, okay, however, or a argument. However, I firmly believe that these companies are not Mother Teresa, so to speak. That really, they're using patients here. And we have to always make sure that patients are not considered commodities in drug development.
I mean, something I noticed in cardiovascular trials is, and we had a lot of empirical data about this, you talk about adverse event reporting, other issues related to study conduct. If a patient knows it's the only way they can get the treatment, and if they go off the trial, they're no longer going to get the type of clinical care that they get in the trial. It's, that raises a number of ethical issues. So getting to the next part of this, the dynamic duo, you and Dr. Bartonelli, our new NCI director, I know is going to be on later. We're counting on you to fix this problem, because I would argue that there is a problem of people leaving the U.S. because it is too expensive and too hard to get things done. What are you going to do to fix it?
Well, of course, we have to launch another project. And we have a project called Project Pragmatica, okay, that is just being rolled out. And this came to me in kind of a lightning bolt when I saw a small trial that was done under LungMap, okay, of ramucirumab plus pembrolizumab versus kind of standard of care. And this was in second-line lung cancer, and it actually won on overall survival. However, there were problems with the trial, the alpha allocation. It really wasn't meant to be a registration trial. And I said, well, this is really kind of an important trial because really we haven't had a lot of advances in this area, so to speak. And I said, well, what am I really interested in here? I'm only interested in one thing only, okay? And what is that? Is there a survival advantage here? Okay, I'm not interested in the safety of these drugs. If we don't know the safety of pembrolizumab at this time after being used, I think, on a million patients worldwide, we better fold up our shop here, so to speak, and likewise for the other drug. And I thought this would really be a great idea of trying to do a pragmatic trial. Here again, preserving randomization, but making it as simple as possible. So what we discussed with the NCI is basically having really only one endpoint of the trial, and that is overall survival. Just give me the data of randomization to data of death, so to speak. Okay, that's the only data point. Eligibility criteria, whoever goes on the trial, that as long as they're second line, I don't care about their BUN, I don't care about their renal function, I don't care about their platelet count, I don't care about their hemoglobin. So very minimal eligibility criteria, and basically no safety reporting other than for hospitalizations or toxicities that are not described in the safety endpoint. And I view this as an important trial and something that we really want to collaborate with the NCI on. We've made these trials way too complicated, just mind-boggling complicated. When I take a look at informed consents that go on for 20 pages, no patient will read this, even if they have a college education or even a physician. You know, having practiced oncology for many years, for over 20 years before I came to the FDA, you know, when I presented somebody with a clinical trial, there was basically only one question that they asked, okay? And that is, if it was your mother, would you put her on this trial? And that's kind of the gut level of ethics that I look at. It's the Dr. Pazdur's ethics rule, so to speak. And I think we have to simplify trials, okay? And this brings us to the question, this field is evolving so fast, we have to answer the questions relatively rapidly. Likewise, one of the areas that I would love to see the NCI work with and more with companies, and I think we've really not had a lot of the NCI trials really take a look at innovative trials. And here again, this is something, if I could foster that relationship. I don't see why we couldn't have the NCI, and this has been done in other trials historically, but on a very limited extent, do the US enrollment of a clinical trial, and then have the company do kind of ex-US enrollment to make sure that the trial is accruing very rapidly. But we do have the NCI involved coordinating the enrollment in the United States, and then combining these databases, and they could easily be done that way.
Well, I would say for every purpose there's a time. And I used to argue with you about this in 2016 because pragmatic trials have been a key part of my specialty. And I think there's a lot at stake for you and Dr. Bartonelli to work this out because, you know, oncology has a lot of special privileges because it's considered so important by so many people. So if you get this right, this could have a huge impact.
Here again,
on
it has to be the
fields.
right drug, the right situation, and this was one of the situations because you had known safety, extensive safety experience, a hard endpoint that one could take a look at, overall survival. But there are other endpoints that could obviously be used that are more real-world endpoints also. But the importance, Rob, is randomization.
Amen.
And that is the issue that we face with all of the data that is coming from the real world community, so to speak, for lack of a better word, historical, external controls, let's say it, have limitations. And it's the beauty of randomization, and I will paraphrase, well, let me just say this. The beauty of randomization really is to take advantage and to address factors that we don't know about, okay? And I think that that is a very important issue. You could think you know everything you know about a disease, okay? But we don't, okay?
Yeah, I would just add one other key factor that we don't talk about enough, which is understanding what time zero is, because the methods of adjusting for differences in characteristics are getting better and better, and there are circumstances where non-randomized data can be used. But when you're trying to guess what time zero is and compare the two groups, there's a growing literature on this. It's a big problem. Let me go to one last area that we've talked about a lot, and I know it's been a bit frustrating for you, and is also something many people are talking about. For a lot of people, their oncology treatment depends on the results of a test. The results of that test, often done in a rarefied environment with no external validation that it's accurate, could lead people to the wrong treatment. And you've had some interesting ideas about how to make this work in oncology. There's also consideration of legislation right now about it. What are your thoughts about testing related to treatment?
Well, I think the issue of, and here again, I was at the agency when we developed the initial kind of concept of one drug, one test. That probably doesn't serve people that well, because in the real world, people use a variety of tests from Mayo Clinic to you name it, MD Anderson, to wherever people do these tests. That's the type of test that they want. So one of the issues that we're discussing about, and hopefully will roll out relatively soon in another pilot program with CDRH, is looking at minimal performance criteria of tests. And rather than having a specific test, okay, having minimal performance criteria of that test embedded into the clinical trial, and then have those patients selected on tests that meet that minimal performance criteria, and those minimal performance criteria will be available on a website, et cetera. And this will get around of one test, one drug, so to speak, that can have unintended consequences from a intellectual property point of view, where one company said, I developed this test, and no, you can't have it because it's associated with this drug, even though, you know, the drug, the patient has, one is developing a very similar test, so it's wasteful in a sense. So having this concept of a minimal performance criteria where they're published, you could use any test that meets that, would be something. Now, that doesn't preclude people from companies developing and commercializing a test, that's for sure, that meets this minimal performance status. But it really kind of broadens the perspective out.
I have to admit, I think that's a pretty clever idea. I would just say, from my perspective, we have vastly underestimated the consequences of errors made in testing and diagnosis. And Harvey Feinberg, who used to be head of the National Institute of Medicine, is very focused on this now. And it really starts with, this a test that you ordered the right test. Is it giving a reliable result, which is more of a technical issue? And then there are a whole set of cognitive issues around how you put the test result together with the proposed treatment. But if we don't have a reliable test to begin with, we're lost, and a lot of people can be hurt by this. So I hope that we come up with more capability of ensuring that the laboratory community is delivering reliable tests, and I think your idea is a very good one. All right, I know we've covered all 10 of my topics in 30 minutes. Do you have any question for me? Last question?
What do you plan on doing after this stint is done?
Golf.
Okay.
No, I mean, I was thinking today, and I'm going to, I think, tweet about this later this afternoon. I'm still tweeting. It's a little risky right now, but I mean, you described how much you enjoy on your job because you get to see the whole spectrum. In my job, I get to see like everything on the face of the earth. So in the course of
Yeah,
one
but it's
week,
kind of too much.
it could be. It just depends on your personality. But through this, you know, whether it's, you know, we had to go after the vaping industry, which is putting out vapes that are completely targeted at children, unbelievably targeted at children. We're dealing with nutrition as a key issue. We just put out over-the-counter naloxone requests. So I don't think I'll have a problem when I finish this stint with a lot of interesting things to think about, but definitely golf is in the future, I can tell you that. All right, we'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay.